the head counselor at the Princeton Review Score Plus. We will soon going to start today's webinar. So today's webinar would be presented by Daryl Johnson, who is the master trainer at the Princeton Review Score Plus. He is also the University of Arizona alumni. He will going to talk on SAT, and the next webinar would be done by Dennis Ortiz. He is also a master trainer at the Score Plus, the academic head, and he is the alumni of William College and Columbia University. So just few housekeeping tips, though Ritu has already mentioned in the chat. Request you all to keep your mic on mute and hide your webcam so that there should not be any delay or interruption during the webinar. Thank you so much.
My name's Daryl Johnson. I'm a teacher and trainer here at the Princeton Review. Here still in lockdown, but here to talk to you about, the SAT and how you can possibly beat it once College Board actually starts administering it again. So right here we have our agenda about what we'll be looking for, just general stuff about the SAT, and we'll be even doing some sample problems here, and we'll talk about how we can help. But let's move on to the next slide. Can we move on to there we go. Oh yeah, that's fun stuff about me. Yeah, you can, that's far too many words just about how important and wonderful I am. Hang on, let me get some paper real quick. Okay. But yeah, let's move on to the next slide here. Yeah, what is the SAT? Yeah, let's talk about that. So yeah, next slide. Okay. Yeah, as for what does the SAT measure, just know that the SAT is not a measure of your worth as a human being in any way. Okay. A lot of people think the SAT is used to measure students' readiness for college or general intelligence, and all of that just isn't true, right? So these tests, they don't measure one's intelligence in any way. But as for being used to award aid, well, yes, that is going to be true. But as for the others, do they reflect your GPA, predict your college GPA? Those just aren't true at all. Your grades are probably a better measure of how good of a student you are or could be, but even that's not perfect. The SAT and all of these standardized tests is just another step removed from that. So just know that that's the bad news, but the good news are the next couple parts of that table is that you can and should prepare for these tests. They are eminently learnable skills, okay? But they don't test what you've learned in high school. Well, they do to a certain degree, like you should be able to read at a certain level, and there are some mathematical concepts that are related, but yeah, do they test what you've learned in high school? Kind of, but not directly. But let's move on to the next slide here. Now, how is it scored? I think most of you are familiar with the whole 200 to 800 scale. Just how the SAT works. You have a math test. It's two sections, sections 3 and 4, as a matter of fact. One no calculator, one calculator. And your reading and writing, you'll have a reading section and a grammar section. Those sections make up your individual math score and reading or verbal score, I should say. And traditionally, those 200 to 800 scaled scores are added together, just conversationally, to make a total overall score of 400 to 1600 that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So let's move on. Now, I get this question a lot. What is a good SAT score? And the answer to that, I mean, the most common answer I get is 1600. Well, okay, sure, that's a perfect SAT score. But as for what's a good SAT score, it really depends on where you're looking to apply, where you're looking to go into college. Because, well, if we look at the next slide, we can see that it really varies from college to college. Now, this table right here, this is just based on, or it's a reflection of how SAT scores can translate into scholarship money, okay? And you can see how SAT scores vary from college to college, okay? And you can see, if you see the fine print there at the bottom, it's at the average merit award for qualifying individuals, and that number, that SAT score, the 1550, 1560, et cetera, that's essentially the minimum cutoff for colleges to start awarding money. This isn't a guaranteed number by any means. These are just statistics that the Princeton Review have compiled based on the things I just mentioned. But I think if you, excuse me, you can apply this also just to straight up admissions. Because say, you know, well, I'm just going to use the 200 to 800 scale on the math. If you're looking to get into, say, Harvard, if you go to their website, incoming freshmen, that middle half, the 25th to 75th percentile, the SAT math scores range from, I think, most recently it said 720 to 790, something like that. With 800 being perfect, that implies to me that, you know, almost a quarter of people who get into Harvard have a perfect score on the math. Well, I mean, Harvard can do that because they're Harvard, you know. But if you're looking to get into a place like, I don't know, Arizona State, that range tends to go from, you know, like 550 to 630, something like that. So, and nothing against Arizona State. I'm a Arizona Wildcat myself, so a little bit against Arizona State. But it's a perfectly fine school. And getting an education there is perfectly acceptable for, you know, tens of thousands of people every single year. So how important the SAT is and what makes for a good score really is dependent on, you know, where you're looking to get your education. But let's take a look at the next slide and we can see just what is actually on the test. Here's the breakdown. I'm sure you've seen it here before. It starts, it's a very predictable test where it starts with a reading section, 5 passages, 2 of which will be more science-y, 2 will be more like social studies or history, and 1 will be literature. And all of those questions just boil down to, what does this say? Which sounds easy, but it's a muscle that a lot of students really haven't had to exercise a lot. Because usually high schoolers are encouraged to, you know, read into a passage, try to interpret things, consider the things going on in the author's life or in history at that time. How does that inform the text? Is there symbolism going on with these characters or whatever? None of that really applies on the SAT. Really, as I said, it just asks some version of, what does this say? Or why did the author provide this detail? A little bit different. But the nice thing is you'll start to notice as you take more of these sample problems that the SAT is really predictable in the types of wrong answers it formulates. And we'll see a few examples of that shortly. Up next, that W and L means writing and language. I just call it the grammar test. It's 35 minutes, 4 passages, pretty much grammar and editing. And then there's 2 math sections, the no calculator section and the calculator section. For those, it's really high school level math, but what makes it, I guess, difficult for some is that the SAT takes particular pride in its ability to trick you, you know, where, you'll have some sort of question where you can solve easily for X, find X equals 4, that's fine. And you see 4 in the answer choices, and so you pick it and move on. But you might not have noticed that the question was actually asking, what's the value of 2X? Well, that's not a math question. That's more of a, were you reading the question, and that's partly why I tell my students that the math test is really more of a reading test than an actual math test, because I don't know if anybody watching has taken any practice tests or the actual SAT before, but if you have, you probably remember at least 1 or 2 math questions where it's like an entire paragraph of text, where it really just rewards you for being able to read through all the stuff and figure out and parse what the actual, point of the question is and what all the numbers that they give you are representing. And finally, yeah, there's the essay. It is optional, where you'll be getting a prompt about, some speech from a politician, and you have to break down not just what this person is saying, but how he or she is developing an argument. But as I said, it is optional. Most colleges don't ask for it, and unless you're applying to one of those schools, I'd say don't really worry about it. But let's move on to the stuff that matters a little bit more. So we can move on to the next slide, please. Just a word about the ACT. The ACT, very similar to the SAT. Their schedules are a little bit different. And the scoring technically is different. Instead of 200 to 800 for each section, the ACT uses a 1 to 36 scoring system, and the ACT also averages its scores rather than accumulates them. But really, they're similar enough tests that I would say just pick one and prepare for it. There are some subtle differences between the two, and I would recommend taking a practice test or looking at sample questions of both to understand the differences between the two. But I don't think we have the time to get through all of that minutia. So I'd say we can move on from this slide here. Now, I mentioned this once before, that the SAT and the ACT is a measure that colleges use to help help determine admissions, but also a high SAT or ACT score can help you out financially as well. The vast majority, it says the majority, it is almost every four-year college will give out merit-based scholarships based on your grades and your test scores. So getting good at these tests, while, yeah, these tests are largely arbitrary and unfair, if you understand what's coming and you know how to answer these questions, it could yield, legitimate monetary benefits for you in the near future. So let's move on. And yeah, planning and preparation are key. So how to do well on the SAT, it really is just familiarity with the tests. All of these five steps really come down to that. Yeah, sure, content knowledge, understand what a quadratic equation is and how to factor it, that sort of stuff. But the big things are those second and third parts of the 5 steps: strategy and technique, where part of your strategy is you want to maximize the points that you earn, right? So you want to make sure to use your time doing questions that you're most likely to get right. And for both SAT and ACT, there's no bonus points for getting harder questions right. So do the questions that are easiest for you. You have a limited amount of time to build up as many points as you can. So use that time doing the questions you're more likely to get right. And when doing those questions, practice the techniques that we show you. You'll start to recognize certain aspects of different problems that will let you know, okay, I see this about a question. I see there's variables in the answer choices. So rather than worry about, say, building all my own algebra, let's turn this into arithmetic and make it a little bit easier on myself. I'm going to follow that technique. On a reading passage, I'm going to be consistent with my technique. Not necessarily read the entire passage all at once like most students tend to do. Instead, get to the questions first. Answer, a specific easy question. And as you answer more questions, you'll read the entire passage just in smaller bite-sized pieces, things like that. And if you practice those techniques, I can tell you it will yield good results. Same thing with the practice and confidence. Just understand what's coming forward and what you're going to see on the test. And yeah, the endurance part, you'll see if you take any one of my classes. We go through a lesson and I'll model some questions and I'll make sure that you're engaged and understanding the techniques and practicing them and all that stuff. But another good part of my classes is just doing sections, right? Just, okay, you have 13 minutes for this one passage, go ahead, and I'll extend that to maybe 2 passages at a time, to 3 passages, because really all of these tests, it's about your endurance. Because really everything about these standardized tests are designed to be artificially harder than they actually need to be. Because, well, just consider this. How many tests in school have you ever taken that last for 4 hours on a Saturday morning, surrounded mostly by strangers, administered by a proctor whom you probably never met, in a classroom you're probably unaccustomed to, even possibly at a school you've never been to, right? So you're already off your game, and now you have this 4-hour test ahead of you. And so that's why I emphasize, practice and endurance. Just get used to trying to focus for such a long period of time doing this, seemingly mundane thing. But let's move on. And okay. So you give me the next one. So the SAT requires go back. The SAT requires testing savvy. You can see these examples here, sort of related to my, what's the value of X, but they're actually asking for 4X. But also, I think these examples here, you're not going to see on the actual SAT, because the SAT words its questions in a very particular way. It will ask, like, what is the value of X? Or what is one possible value of X? It's not just going to be find X or name the quadrilateral. I named my square Bob, right? Like, those aren't technically wrong answers based on how they're worded, which is why the SAT words its questions so differently. But the next thing is, we can go to the next slide, is that people are predictable. Because now, usually, when, I have a room full of people to actually talk to, I'll ask people, just give me a number. And people will tell me like 7, 18, 5 or whatever. And you can think of whatever number you want. Chances are that whatever number you're thinking of is a positive number. And it's probably an integer, meaning not a decimal or a fraction. And it's probably not tremendously huge, right? And every time I ask this question, just give me a number, I get numbers, 8, 12, 14, nothing too big, but, you could have thought of 11 billion. You could have said -8. You could have said the square root of 2. You could have said pi, right? All of those are numbers, but whenever I ask the question, all I ever get are small positive integers. That just shows that you are predictable, which is something that the SAT loves to exploit. because, well, the next example here works better in a live situation, but we'll try it here. Just to yourself, just think, okay, what's the color of the background on your screen right now? And then consider what's the cloth that we get from worms. Really nice cloth, nicer than my shirt, you know. Think about that. And then think about, what do cows drink? Okay, yeah, you might have thought milk, because I primed you by thinking about the color white and the fabric of silk, but cows don't drink milk. Calves do, but cows drink water, right? And if you fell into that trap, like a lot of you might have, there's nothing to feel bad about. It just shows that you're a human being. And the SAT really likes to exploit that. Going back to my, what's the value of 2x thing? A certain percentage of students, the SAT knows, or ETS, the company that writes it, knows that a certain percentage of students are going to fall into that trap. Back to my original point of making the test artificially harder than it needs to be. So let's move on. Yeah, okay. So here's a good example here. So I don't have the benefit of a tablet here. Just this format doesn't let me use PowerPoint and my tablet software at the same time. So I think you'll just have to indulge my my speech here. But you hopefully had a chance to look at this question. A store raises the price of an item by 20%, then decreases the new price by 15%. What was the percent change in the price of an item? Now, a lot of students will look at this question and see, okay, something's going up by 20 and then going down by 50, and I guess it went up by 5. But of course, the SAT isn't going to be that simple, where you can answer the question with really one step of arithmetic, right? And the same thing with just, even adding them together. I saw somebody say 35. Well, that's another question, or that's another answer that you can reach with one step of arithmetic. And if it's a multiple choice question, chances are 5 and 35 are in the choices, and those would be wrong. Because, well, think about it like this. Let's just, since we're dealing with percentages, an easy number to start with is 100. So let's raise the price of that by 20%. We're up to 120. Now let's decrease that by 15%, not $15, but by 15%. So, well, what's 15% of 120? Well, 10% of 120, just move the decimal over, that'd be 12. So if 10% is 12, then 5% would be 6. So 12 and 6 is 18, which means 15% of 120 is 18. So let's decrease that 120 by 18. Now we're at 102. So what was the percent change in the price of the item? Well, it increased by 2%, which if you're, not 1,000% comfortable with percentages, isn't necessarily the most obvious answer. But that's just the sort of thing the SAT likes to do. So we can take a look at the next one here for another example. Can we move to the next one, please? I think we've talked about that and how that's phrased out. Yeah, I want to get to a couple other things. Yeah, I'll make the pacing point here. Just very briefly, you can finish, you can go to the whole thing about how I mentioned spend your time doing questions you're more likely to get right, because a lot of students will, that's good. A lot of students will want to rush through the passages or rush through an entire section because of that ticking clock. But that tends to be unwise, because racing through a question means you're more likely to misread those sorts of questions and make mistakes, where you're getting only half or a little under half of the questions right, but if you just slow down and do the questions you're more likely to get correct, you'll end up doing much better, even if you don't get to every single question. Because, well, the SAT separates its difficulty levels into thirds. You'll have a third of the section will be easy, and you'll have a similar number of medium questions and a similar number of hard questions. Now, if you just do the easy and medium questions, and because you slowed down and took your time and got those right, well, you're going to get, let's just use the 200 to 800 scale here, that's probably going to score you around a 600. And most students would be pretty happy with a 600 on their SAT math or verbal, which just is another example of how the SAT really isn't like any other test that you've ever taken. Because how many tests have you taken that let you just completely ignore a third of it and still get a pretty decent score? Most of the time that's a D, but that's pretty decent on the SAT. But let's move on to the next slide. And we can see some sample questions. First, we'll look at a reading question. So here I'll just let you know this is a literature passage. We're only looking at a certain part of it. The question here is asking the primary impression created by the narrator's description of Henrietta in lines 50 to 58 is that she is. Well, I'd say, well, let's look at the paragraph itself, right? And see if we see anything about how Henrietta is described. Well, looking in that paragraph, we see, yeah, she was not afraid. Mr. Tupper sat down, and then when it appeared there weren't going to be matches in his pockets, she gathered her shears and her curtain and the folds of her material into one hand and found him a packet of matches with the other, so that he didn't have to get up and go out to the kitchen after all. Okay, so she's, I don't know, thinking ahead and doing something nice for him, I guess. So let's take a look at these answers and see if we can eliminate any. So A, confident and resourceful. Well, she's using shears and helping out. That seems to make a certain amount of sense. B, simple and impatient. Well, simple, maybe, but you could say simple is kind of insulting, and that doesn't really fit. But I don't see any evidence of her being impatient here. And then C, helpful and impoverished. Okay, so, well, helpful, she certainly is helpful, but I'd say this is one of those half right, half wrong questions, because impoverished means just you're really poor, right? You don't have any money. I don't really see any evidence that she's impoverished. She's just helping out and getting a guy matches, And then D, older and fearless. I don't see evidence of either of those, right? No evidence of what her age is and how fearless she is. And so generally, I would say, she's portrayed relatively positively. I'd probably go with A, just because B, C, and D, there's a good reason to get rid of those others, So let's take a look at another one here. All right, here we have what we call the vocab in context question. Here, as used in line 72, kicked off most nearly means, well, you've seen those words before, but the question's asking, what does this word or phrase mean in the context of the passage? And here we have this person saying, I'm 57, I'd be 58 in January, and I might have kicked off any time during the last 10 years. And yeah, he glanced out of the corner to see whether or not he was shocked. The idea held no terror for her. Maybe that can be a little helpful. I'm convinced that it was a mistake. I should have thought more about it. Okay, so here, it seems that he's just saying, I'm getting old here. And if you had the benefit of the entire passage, the blurb up top would tell you, when it was written. And this is a fairly old passage. But also, let's just look at these other answers. Because, okay, jumped up, I don't see any evidence that he's jumping. And started out, why would you start off? He's just talking about how old he is. I think most nearly C fits, right? I might have passed on, which is interesting because he's using a euphemism, and then the right answer to the question is another euphemism for dying. But okay, that's just another side point there. And then D knocked away. That's potentially a little too literal there. So yeah, that's pretty clearly going to be passed on. The vocab and context questions tend to be on the easier side comparatively, so be sure to get to those, if not at the very beginning, but then, early on in your approach. But let's take a look at, I think we have a grammar one next. Next slide, please. There we go. All right. So with grammar, there's really two types of questions. There's proofreading questions like, where should the comma go? Or what's the right tense for this verb? And there's editor questions, which is what we see here, where it's asking what most effectively combines the underlined sentences, where we have two sentences. Art schools are increasingly looking for students with a background in physics. They don't want students who have only studied drawing or painting. Okay. So two different sentences, but we need to combine them. These questions right here, here's your first tangible thing just to keep in mind any grammar section. If you see a combination question, it's really just asking which one is the most concise, right? And so just glancing at these, it looks like B and C are the closest, are the shortest ones, right? Whereas like A just adds the same problem, or just has the same words, but puts because in between them, and that doesn't really make a lot of sense. They're looking for students with a background in physics because they don't want students. That's kind of changing the meaning there. And then with D, well, that's just using the same words, but having a semicolon, and then this is because that's probably the least concise. I'd get rid of D right off the bat. So now we have B and C, similar length, so let's just see which one is better. We get art schools are increasingly looking for students with a background in physics, not just in drawing or painting. That seems to capture it. And then C, increasingly studying physics, art schools don't only look for drawing. Wait, so art schools are studying physics? That doesn't make any sense. That's a misplaced modifier right in there. It's got to be B. So really, with these combination questions, it is just find the shortest one, make sure it means the same thing, it doesn't have any grammatical errors. That's going to be your answer. Okay, how about the next one? All right, so the writer's considering deleting the underlined sentence, another editor question, where it's not necessarily about the grammar, it's about whether it makes sense to put this detail in. So let's just take a look at this paragraph. We've got, unlike light bulbs, which emit light of many different wavelengths in all directions, a laser produces a focused beam of light of a specific wavelength. And we got our underlined sentence about how laser is an acronym that stands for light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. Remember that, it's a good trivia question. But regardless, the paragraph goes on by saying, light wavelengths cover a spectrum from low intensity infrared light to high intensity ultraviolet light. Just as ultraviolet light causes damage to our skin in the form of sunburn and skin cancer, ultraviolet lasers can easily damage artworks. Okay, so it seems that the overall point of this is not just educating us about, what lasers are and how they work, but it's about, the effect it has on artwork or things like that, right? So should we have this little fact about the acronym laser? Well, I mean, it's perhaps interesting, but I probably would delete it. Because, okay, A, it does define the term laser, but it's not necessarily relevant. And with B, it doesn't do anything to explain anything about what art schools are doing. Right, that's just out the window. So it's got to be C or D. And then with C, deleted because it contradicts the passage's claim about lasers. It doesn't contradict anything. It's just not relevant. So the answer would have to be D, because, yeah, I mean, it's nice to know what laser stands for, but it's not really relevant to the topic at hand. And so for these types of questions, first off, usually for these keep it or delete it questions, it's better to leave things as they were. But in this case, we actually do want to delete it because the other thing to keep in mind is just, is it relevant and is it helpful? Here, mildly helpful, somewhat interesting, but not really relevant to the point about how lasers work and their effect on art. Okay, let's move on. Now we have some math, but notice that the math question is as much a reading question as the previous reading questions. So we have this person, Yuan Hui, I guess. Don't let the names of these fake people slow you down. I just say, okay, some person enjoys seeing movies. Costs her $12.50 to see a movie at the theaters, and it costs her $2 to stream a movie over the internet. Okay. She wants to watch at least 14 movies a week, but she can spend at most $35 a week on movies. Which of the following systems of inequalities represents the situation in terms of A and B, where A is the number of movies she sees in the theater, and B is the number of movies she streams online? So there's a lot going on here. But let's take it into little bite-sized pieces. So we know that it's $12.50 to see a movie at the theaters, and the theaters is A. So we need $12.50 to be associated with A, which it seems is true for all of them. Same thing for the 2 needs to be associated with the B. Okay, next thing. She wants to watch at least 14 movies. Well, at least, that means she could watch 14 or 15 or 16. So we want a number that's greater than or equal to 14, right? So we want greater than or equal to 14. So I would get rid of A and get rid of C, right? Because those have A plus B is less than or equal to 14. So now we're down to B and D. All right, the next thing, she can spend at most $35 a week. Well, okay, that's a clear difference between B and D. One says greater than or equal to 35 or less than or equal to 35. Well, at most $35 a week would imply less than or equal to 35. So the answer there is going to have to be D. And this is a fairly common thing on the math where you notice we really didn't do any math, or at least no real calculations, you know. We just were able to eliminate stuff as we went on, you know. So yeah, not so bad if we take it into little pieces. Let's take a look at one more here. So now we have at a bakery, person, Bukra, I don't know, uses P pounds of flour to make C cakes. P equals C minus 2 when C is greater than 2. How many additional pounds of flour does she need to make each additional cake? Now, where'd my pen go? I only have this plastic. There we go. I have a pencil. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to plug in a number here. I'm just going to say, all right, let's say C is 5, right? She wants to make 5 cakes. And then it says she uses P pounds of flour to make C cakes. And it says P equals C minus 2. Well, then that means P would be 3 pounds of flour, right? So now how many additional pounds of flour does she need to make each additional cake? So to make an additional cake, well, that's going to be 6 cakes to make an additional cake. And P in that case is going to be 6 minus 2, which is 4. So it goes from 3 pounds of flour to 4 pounds of flour. I guess that means to make that additional cake, she's going to need 1 more pound of flour, right? And this is a version of what we call plugging in, where you have variables related to each other, but we just put numbers in to make it easy. And you can see in my notes, yeah, where you could just have the numbers right there in front of you, so that you know you're not making some sort of silly error, you know. Okay, how about the next one? Yeah, I think we got one more here. Yeah, the track at a local gym was recently renovated so that 1 lap around the track increased in distance from 100 yards to approximately 122 yards. of the following, which is the closest to the increase in the distance of a single lap in meters. So this is a classic conversion or rates or proportions question. I think of it just as proportions because it tells us that 1 meter is 1.1 yards. So in my, on my scratch paper, well, you don't get scratch paper, in my blank area in the booklet, I'm just going to say, okay, 1 meter over 1.1 yards, right? Because it's a proportion. X over Y equals X over Y. So I have 1 meter over 1.1 yards equals, well, let's see, it increased from 100 yards to 122 yards. And it's asking for the increase in meters. Well, we know the increase in yards pretty obviously is 22 yards. So I'm going to put 22 on the bottom of my next one and X as my meters, right? So, I have something like that, right? Just set it up like that, And of course you can cross multiply 22 times 1 equals 1.1 times X, right? And then 22 divided by 1.1, well, that's going to leave X equals 20 for meters. 20 meters. So just set it up like that. 22 equals 1.1x and solve it through. There we go, right? Just keep yourself organized, stay consistent, okay? All right, let's move on then. So just to close, this was just a brief sampling of how I approach, the 3 very general types of questions that you're likely to see on the SAT. Just know that we can help you with all of this. And if you follow my advice or the advice of whatever teacher or tutor you find, your scores will go up, right? So let's move on to the next slide here. And you can see, as I've mentioned, the SAT and the ACT, they're not like any other test you're used to, but they are predictable and learnable skills, okay? A lot of people will try to rush through the test, misread problems, but remember that even though these tests are, unfair and arbitrary, they are indeed learnable. You can improve at these tests. So yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, and the right prep makes all the difference. Now here are some things that we offer here. My personal goal with all of these sessions is just to inform you that whatever you do with regard to the SAT or the ACT, don't take these tests blind. The fact that you're here watching this is a step in the right direction. Just make sure you've taken at least a full-length practice test. Get used to how long it is and the types of questions. See how you score, and then use that to help you determine exactly, what route you want to take in your prep process. Now you can see we have all sorts of different classes, courses, tutorials available for you. There's the SAT self-paced version where you'll have access to our online student center, and you'll be able to look at the video lessons and do practice tests and questions on your own at your own pace. We do have a recommended syllabus or schedule that you can follow, but it is mostly up to you, and then you can meet with us for individual questions. Then we have the blended and the ultimate live online questions. Those are, well, live online similar to this. The real difference is just the number of hours we would take to go through everything that we need. And I'd say based on your score and your practice test, we can recommend either one of those for whatever you're looking for. And the SAT regular or premium live online courses, that is going to be like a full 36-hour course with 2.5 or maybe even 3-hour classes, where we go through absolutely every lesson in our SAT manual. You'll get this whole book, and we'll be doing some drills and such from this book of 10 practice tests, where you can just practice questions that you're likely to see on the SAT in a timed and an untimed format. Okay. Now, as for the SAT Elite, with a 1,500 score guarantee, that has a prerequisite where if you're already scoring at least 1,400, you can enroll in that particular course, and we can guarantee a score of 1,500. But I would say wherever you are, look for improvement. My personal goal with all my students is to see at least 100-point improvement in both math and verbal each. But you know, every student is a little bit different, has different goals. So just at the very least, start by taking a practice test, see where you are, and use that to help determine what sort of prep you would be right for you, whether it be just get a hold of some books and do some self-paced prep, or joining one of my classes or classes of one of my colleagues. So we can move on. I think we got a couple more slides in here, if I remember correctly. Now, all this stuff about test scores, really, it's certainly helpful, but it's not all of your application, right? And actually, the most important part of your application is your grades. So if you're in 9th or 10th grade, you still have some time to make sure that, you know, you're getting A's and B's on your report card. If you're a little bit later on and your grades aren't necessarily as grand as you would like them to be, the good news is the second most important part of your application is the test scores, and you can certainly boost your application's chances of being accepted by having great test scores. And that's my specialty, getting your SAT scores or your ACT scores up. But don't forget also that you want to have a good full application, good well-rounded application. Have a, you know, if it's required, have good letters of recommendation. Have good statements of purpose or essay samples or whatever they're asking you for, and ask for help from others for that. And shortly, we'll be joined by Dennis, who will get into a little bit more detail about how to make that great application and improve that. How about the next thing here? Next slide, please. There we go. This is related to what I've already said, right? We have options for every schedule, every budget. Yeah, yeah, you can, there we go. This here is definitely helpful because this is a screenshot of our online student center where if you look at this, this is our practice tests, okay? Where you can see that on the Online Student Center, you can gauge your progress. You can see individual scores, and if you click on each individual test, you can see how you answered on each question and what you can do to improve, okay? But in addition to this, in the Online Student Center, you also have you know, full lessons and practice questions and all that good stuff. I think we're nearing the end of this. Is there another slide after this? I think. Yeah, well, this is just further stuff that we can indeed help. We're running a little short on time, I think. This isn't the ideal scenario here, but yeah, can you, if there are any questions over the chat, are there any questions right now? No, nothing. Okay, well, we'll have time for a Q&A session as well at the end. Oh, how do I handle time per question? I don't worry about time per question. Time per question, if you're worrying about every passing second, then you're wasting time. Instead, just pace yourself so that you know when a question might be taking too long and you should move on to another question. But if you're thinking, oh, gee, I have 1 minute and 42 seconds per question, well, now you've wasted time just thinking that. So I wouldn't think about that. I would just say, with practice, your pacing will improve, just with further exposure to questions. I saw another question about like how to apply for the SAT. Their website is collegeboard.org. That's BOARD, collegeboard.org. That's the company that administers the test, and it'll tell you about future dates. So far, they've announced that there will be an August test, whether in person or online is still a little bit up in the air. But just you can go there as your primary source for when you can take the SAT next. Anything else? I saw a few other little windows pop up, but I don't. Does it matter how many times the test is taken? The answer to that is yes and no. Now, if you decide to take it a second time or a third time, that's not going to make a huge difference. And most colleges will just take your highest scores, and most colleges will also take the highest math score and the highest verbal score, even if they didn't happen on the same day. That's what they call super scoring. And so most students actually do take the SAT a second and sometimes a third time. But now, I don't know if many of you will have the opportunity to take the SAT more than 2 or 3 times, but I'd say plan on taking it at the very most 3 times, because, you know, while taking it multiple times doesn't make that much of a difference, if you have 4, 5, 6 tests where all the scores are pretty much the same, that's not going to look fantastic, and it's also a waste of your time and money that you could have spent on improving the other side or the other aspects of your application. So I'd say plan for that. Any other questions? Sorry, that was a little garbled. What was that? No? Okay. Yeah, whoever's trying to talk, I think the mic isn't exactly perfect. So if you have a question, you can type it in the chat, or hold off for an hour, because shortly we'll be joined by Dennis, who will go into more detail about the application process and how to get the most out of that aspect of the application. Okay, well, if there aren't any other further questions, I'd say stand by for just a couple minutes, and you'll be joined by my colleague to go into the admission side of things.
Thank you so much, Daryl. Yeah. So, Dennis, you can show your presentation.
Okay. Well, good chatting with you all, and I'll see some of you soon, I hope.
See you.
You can just
Okay.
You can hide your webcam, Dennis. Daryl, yeah.
Okay. So I have made the presenter. Okay.
Share your screen, Dennis.
Yeah. Share.
Yeah, that's good.
Can you see?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you, Dennis. You can start.
Okay. Can you see me? Because I don't know if I clicked on I think I clicked on the webcam.
No, they can't see you.
They cannot see me. Let me see. Let's see. Okay. So maybe.
Yeah, now it's
Hello.
fine.
Okay.
Now
But
you're, yeah.
So, all right. Let me move this to the side. So I'm Dennis Ortiz, and I am one of Daryl's colleagues. I also teach SAT and ACT and everything else that Daryl teaches pretty much. But here I am in my admissions counseling capacity. So I want to talk a little bit to you guys about how to build an impressive activity list for admissions, and especially with an eye toward admissions with scholarships, right? So let me, oh, wait 1 second. Yes, that's what I wanted. Okay, so let's talk about essentially what we're going to discuss. So one, why is an activity list an admissions requirement? So, especially if you're in 11th and 12th grade, and I was watching some of you in the chat, I know a number of you are in 11th and 12th grade. So you may have started this process already. Maybe you just downloaded like a questionnaire from, rather an application from a website, for example, and you started filling it in. And you might notice that they constantly ask for activities, right? So you might think, why do they need to know that? Well, we'll talk about that. Okay. What activities may you consider? Essentially, anything that you do outside of school, but we'll talk about that as well. And finally, we have an extended version of tips to create an impressive activity list. And I have some advice for you. Given my experience in editing essays, I've seen a lot of stuff that people, shouldn't put down or maybe should elaborate on. So anyway, let's get started. Yes. Okay. What universities look at an activity list? So one, they want to see, so one of the reasons it's part of the whole application process is that they want to know what matters most to you, right? So it isn't really, what activities are better than others, but what matters most to you. And then they have it because especially American universities, they want a sense of who you are as a person, meaning outside of studies. So, if you think about, Daryl, I know discussed GPA somewhat extensively. So, but this is outside of GPA, right? And I'm going to come back to this again and again, because they really want to know what kind of person you are, okay? So the list of the things that you are actively and productively involved in. So that might be an official club, or it might be something else. Maybe a project that you have undertaken, privately on your own volition. Okay. And they also want to know how you will become an actively contributing member of the university. In other words, they again, and especially with American schools, they don't just want to know how you are going to, do in the classroom, right? The classroom is essentially, for universities especially, the classroom is maybe 10, 15% of your entire college experience. And that might shock you, but that is the case, right? You have to live there, right? And so how will you construct your life to contribute to the community as a whole? Okay, and oops, and what have you learned? Sorry, yeah. What have you learned from your activities and how they helped you develop, right? So as you're thinking about what to put into your list, I would consider these options, or these questions rather. Okay. Let me move this over here. Okay, so what activities you should consider? Activities you are committed to, right? So that's important, which showcase your leadership skills, your interests, and your contribution. So let me go back, right? So you can have, for example, if you have, let's say 10 activities from your freshman year, right? They don't really know, or the university doesn't really know what's important to you. However, if you have 3 activities, let's say the newspaper, the student government, and some volunteer work, that is a much more streamlined list of activities, right? And that shows your interests, and it highlights your contribution, and it's also and it can also showcase your leadership skills. In other words, you know, again, you don't just want to say, oh, I've been in these 10, you know, clubs, but you want to say, oh, you know, in this club I began, let's say, I don't know, Spanish club or whatever. You know, I started out, you know, I went as a freshman, and then, you know, by the time I was a junior, I was a director of the whole thing, that kind. So that kind of progress is what they're looking for, right? And again, the last point on this slide tells you that activities which showcase your initiative and responsibility. So consider, again, the places where you have changed something for the better, or times when you had to, you know, be responsible for example, treasure, a bunch of money, and I give you a treasurer, right? Let's say, for example, you were responsible for that money. So that is just something that shows responsibility, right? So it's anything you've done outside the classroom, but again, with these caveats in mind. So what do you do if you have too many activities? Okay, so again, just going on what I said on the previous screen, choose quality over quantity. And again, right, better to have three activities of quality over many activities where you just, you know, show up essentially, right? The second point I think is important because I think it's a cultural thing. Do not confuse academic awards with extracurricular activities, and I'm going to talk about this kind of in more detail. Okay, so what extracurricular activities are meant to highlight is something called, right, academic curiosity. Okay. So academic curiosity, by the way, even though the name sounds quite fancy, doesn't mean that you're curious in class. In fact, it doesn't mean that at all, right? Because that is the classroom setting. No, academic curiosity, they would consider, the universities would consider any kind of action that you as a student undertake to show that you love learning, but it has to be outside the four walls of a classroom. Now, I know that some of you, depending on where you go to school, are kind of focused in the classroom. And even when you write essays, for example, I get a lot of, like, you know, academic stories about academic achievements and such, right? That's not the point. The point is that they want out, you know, how have you challenged yourself when you don't have a teacher kind of over your head, right? What self-motivation do you have? So let me give you an example. A good example of academic curiosity, and you can even say this is an extracurricular activity, especially now in this situation. Let's say that you have taken this opportunity, being at home, and let's say both your parents work from home, so they're busy all day, and you have decided to teach yourself how to cook to make their lives easier. That would be an excellent extracurricular activity, right? And that would display what academic curiosity. All right, so and then of course, bullet point 3 use additional information, right? Which means that again, not in the actual academic stuff that you're reporting.
Lena, can you please mute your mic? Lena Bijoy. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So anyway, so you use the additional information section, right? So even that tells you that it's not really a part of your.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lena, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Can you mute your mic?
I have.
Okay.
All right. So anyway, so
Yeah.
let's continue. Oops, sorry. What if you do not have too many activities? Okay, so do not panic. Cause, as I just said, right? Like, so teaching yourself to cook would be a good example. Now, I'm saying that if it's true, don't make up a story, which is another thing I'll talk about in just a second. But college admissions advisors would prefer to see a few activities that you've done rather than lots of them. And again, they don't have to be, they can be volunteering, at a particular place. If you go with, the certain mindset that you want to help people and you learn something from that experience, that might be a good experience to take. Or maybe, during this time of a lockdown, you have volunteered to tutor some of your colleagues via Zoom or whatever, right? So, these are the kind of things that admissions officers are looking for. So, excuse me, the activity list in the application form. And the one I'm most familiar with, actually, I'm familiar with Common App and University of California. The Coalition, I'm a little less. But the Common App, you may enter up to 10 extracurricular activities. Can I just make a point, just to make clear? Because I think a lot of students also think this. Just because they give you 10 spaces doesn't mean you have to put in 10, right? Because I get even like graduate students who, they say, for example, if you write an essay where you say, oh, okay, so do you have anything to tell us that's extra? And I'm like, do you really need to, do you really need that space? Rather than doing a whole different essay, you would do, work on something you've already done. So again, you don't need to put 10, they just give you space for 10. Okay. So the position description or an organization name, 50 characters. That's characters, not words, by the way. Up to 150 characters of space for describing each activity. Again, that's characters, not words. In the coalition, you may enter up to 8 activities. Again, let me remind you, you don't need to put all 8, only if you have them, but you can put up to 8. And here it's up to 250 characters. And the University of California system, which is its own system, of course, Yeah. Does they give you up to 20 spaces for extracurricular activities? Again, you don't have to put in 20, right? Okay. So universities having their own application portal will also have similar specifications to the University of California system they meet. So let's check in the tips to create an impressive common app list, common app activity list. So, okay. So number one, state your role and the organization in the top box. Now, this is actually kind of a style issue, but also kind of grammar as well, as we'll talk about in just a second. So in the top box, right? And this is, again, maybe not such a common activity here, but in the States, it's a very common activity. And before I get into this, let me just say that, you know, you have to be aware, especially if you're applying to the States, that you're applying to a different cultural context. So I know that here, for example, MUN, or Model United Nations, is a very popular activity, right? But in the States, I promise you, nobody knows what MUN is. Now, forget for the reasons why that is, but the point is that, you know, so when you talk about, for example, if you are in MUN, it's a very important part of your extracurricular activities. You know, if you just say MUN and expect people to understand what that means, they won't, right? So just say Model United Nations, it's not going to kill you, right? So that's the kind of thing that you need. Okay. Anyway, let's go back to this. So school newspaper and description. I am the editor for the school newspaper. Okay. So one suggestion that I have for you is don't repeat words, right? You already have school newspaper in the top box. You don't reuse that word when you're describing it. Okay. So try something different. So for example, you might want to talk about your specific role. For example, editor of international column for the school newspaper. Even better if you have a title for it. Responsible for brainstorming, revising, and supervising articles by other writers from my column. Okay, which is what an editor does. Right. So, this is very much like writing a resume, which you will have to do in the future when you're looking for a job, but that's number one, okay? Number two, and I cannot emphasize this more, emphasize tangible, measurable impact. Think numbers, okay? If they're available. So whom did your activity help? How many people? How much money did you raise? Instead of raise money for children to Africa, right? Sure. Well, what does that mean? How much money did you raise, right? Children in Africa. Africa's a continent, right? Where in Africa, right? So try raise $3,000 to provide 3 uniforms and scholarships. Again, see how specific this is for students attending the Joseph Awera Homeschool in Kenya. Okay, so again, both the same activity, but the second one much more streamlined and really gives people or the admissions officers especially a very concrete sense of what is going on. Okay. Use active words for what you actually did, and I would actually say this is even for the essays, and not only the school essays you write for school. For example, so again, the school newspaper, right? I am the editor for the school newspaper. But again, in the description box, and here I'm going to highlight something different, responsible for brainstorming, revising, and supervising articles, right? So these are active words, right? As a, you know, even if you say editor is, you know, but you say brainstorming, revising, and supervising articles, right? By other columns, which is what an editor does, as I said earlier. So you have to think about what, you know, your role is, and then think about how to actually talk about that. 4, to fit in more info, use lists. Don't use complete sentences, cut extra words. Instead of, I raised my engineering to a school in Ghana and Africa by signing teachers on bracelets, try arrange advertising events, organize fundraisers, and gave presentations at school meetings. Okay, so again, it might be the same person, but if you notice the second example makes the person sound much busier, right? And that's the point. Next, use the present tense if it's something you still do. Yes, yes. As I said, but so here I would say, so think, again, because you should think about what you're doing, before you put it down. So if you can say, for example, look, I taught her this specific, these specific subjects. And again, as I said in the presentation itself, if you have numbers, even better. So let's just say, I tutored her in Spanish, and I started at ab inicio, which is the beginning, right? And then she struggled a lot. And, this past semester, she got a B+. So that kind of information, So yeah, almost anything can work.
Advait, would comparing and hosting events count as an extracurricular activities?
What is it again?
Hosting events.
Well, I mean, do you mean? I'm sorry to ask, but do you mean online or do you mean actual hosting?
Actual hosting.
Well, okay. So hosting events, and what's the other thing that he asked?
Comparing.
Comparing events? I'm not sure what that means, but hosting events certainly.
I mean, being an anchor of the event, no?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So if in the school you're given the responsibility to represent, right? Because that's what you're doing if you're hosting an event, to represent people from outside the school community, right? And let's say you're responsible for, let's say, finding housing, or making sure that there are meals, right? Yeah, so this is part of hosting. So, and what, think about it. What must your school think of you, quote unquote, right? If you are who they pick, right? So definitely. But again, you need to think, you need to think about how you would describe it, although I've given you kind of hints, but anyway.
If I am a head of debate, and if I have won debate competitions, they can put separately under the activity list, one for leadership and one for skill in the activity itself.
That's a good question. No, I wouldn't. I don't know if Ruchika might have a different opinion, but because again, let me make a point. They're not looking, at least in the US, they're not really looking for your skill. I mean, even though you may have one, right? The point is that, so in debate, which I was also in high school, and I also won a number of state championships. But I put that in my application, not because I wanted to say, hey, I'm so great, right? Because I wanted them to understand that this meant a lot to me. And this is where I spent most of my weekends, right? So, of course, if you spend a lot of time at something, eventually you're going to get good at it. So again, I would put that skill as part of your leadership. I wouldn't put it as separate.
Is it a good idea to describe a thesis I wrote as an ECA? For example, I wrote a thesis regarding the caste system in India outside my sociology coursework last year. Does this count?
Okay, so you wrote, sorry, so you're asking me whether to describe the thesis?
Yeah, I mean to list down the thesis in the activity list.
No, well, again, that's not an extracurricular activity. However, I would definitely put it somewhere in your application, right? So very often they ask for writing samples. So I might send them the thesis as an example of something I've done.
And how about
Right.
the research column, Dennis? There is a research tab also.
Correct. Yeah, so you could also put it there, yes.
Okay. Next is under the activity list, how would I mention why I did the course? Can you give an example of the way I can put that in words to fit in the very short word limit?
So wait. What do you mean by the course?
The courses done for, I mean, different courses other than the school courses.
Other than that, well, that's the point, right? So other than the school courses. So you wouldn't, so again, because, there are a number of things in the application, right? So there is that, activity list, which is what it sounds like. It's a list. Now, if you're talking about maybe you can take one of those items, which is the point. You can take one of those items, maybe one of those courses, and maybe write an entire essay on it. Right? And that would be where you would talk about your motivation and why you did that, is that's a fuller explanation of why you did that thing, right? And let me give you another tip, because in the activities list, so let's say you score an interview, right? So maybe they'll ask you about that activity, right? So that's the point of an activity list, like to give them sort of raw material to find out more about you. Are there any questions about it?
Yeah, how can one register for SAT courses? So, Zima, are you talking about our courses? If so, then in the next slide, I'll share the information wherein you can drop an email, and we will connect with you to share all the details. And if it is related to the main SAT, I am not sure, then it's a college board. Again, we can help you doing that. Just drop us an email on the information I will share, and we will going to help you. What about interests like reading books, making Lego block models, the ones which you are not organized, but the ones which are not organized activity, but one is passionate about?
So that is an excellent question, Raja, right? So look, so if you could say like, so let's say the Lego blocks, right? I'm going to use that as an example. And let's say you put that, you say, put that in one of your activity slots. Again, that is going to raise questions, which might be good in the minds of the admissions officers, right? Especially if you don't write an essay on it. If you do write an essay on it, you might even carve your whole essay around that thing. However, I would leave that for the essay portions, meaning I wouldn't actually put that in if it's not organized, right? I wouldn't actually put it in the extracurricular activities unless you are the one who organizing it, right? But if it's just something you do that builds your creativity that you do on your own, such as reading, which of course I understand because I do as well. I think a better place to showcase that would be if you read a particular book that really changed your view on something. And again, you write an essay based on that, right? So that's a better plan than to put that in the organized category. But yes, but those are important, Raja. I'm just saying, but maybe not in the extracurricular spaces itself.
Yeah, so Rajat, you are having so many spaces in your application. It's just not activity list wherein you can list down all your activities which you are doing. There are other places as well wherein you can put all the other things which are not organized the way Dennis has mentioned.
Correct. Yes. Right. That's what I was saying. Correct. Right. But here I would stick to kind of organized stuff.
Sure. Arya, we just discussed this. Could anchoring, hosting events, holding meetings, and attending workshops be counted as an extracurricular activities? Yes, definitely it will count as.
Yeah, certainly. But again, I just want to make a point. It's up to you how to market that. I mean, essentially, we're marketing yourself, right? So, don't just say you held meetings. Say that, you led people in a group to discuss blah blah blah, right? So, as I showed in the slides.
Alina, I only now started going for tennis classes, so can I add that I'm in 12th grade now? So she has just started tennis classes.
Oh yeah, okay. So all right, so so this is a point. This is something we used to have in the old slides. I don't know if you remember, Rushika. Like, so so why? I'm just gonna ask a question. I don't expect an answer, but why did you wait until 12th grade to do tennis, right? So I would think long. I mean, obviously you're gonna put that, because your time is spent doing tennis, right? So so that's one of the things they want from you is to really account for your time when you're not in the classroom, right? So, but so I would consider about why you waited till 12th grade. And there may be reasons for that, but I just don't want, again, to give the impression that that you've got a lot of activities that begin in like 11th and 12th grade, because again, most university advisors are pretty hip to right to what's going on. They're going to see that, oh, so this person attended a seminar on admissions counseling, and then that fall just so you don't want to give that impression, right? But certainly you will talk about tennis, but I'm just curious as to why you waited till 12th grade. I'm just saying, so you should think about that.
So Suzanne, what about writing poems and sonnets? Are they activities?
Again, sure, but I wouldn't, again, as Ruchika said earlier, there are other places in your application where you can talk about that, right? I wouldn't necessarily put them in an organized way, unless of course, maybe you're head of the literary magazine or you're an editor in the literary magazine, and they published a number of your poems or short stories or whatever, and you can even send them a copy, right? Which is what I did when I was at your age. So yeah.
Or maybe she can create a blog and put it there.
There were no blogs when I was in Denver, but yes.
Yeah. Okay, Arya, how can we register for SAT? Okay. How can we register for SAT courses and when should we write them? So if you are in, I want to know in which grade you are in. So one student also asked before. So if you are in 10th grade, I would recommend you start with PSAT rather than SAT, because PSAT, SAT is mostly the ideal time is to take it in 11th grade. So if you're in 11th grade or in 12th, if you're in 11th grade, you are having enough time to practice well and take your test. If you're in 12th grade, then you actually have to rush and do it as soon as possible. When should you write, if in case it means by date? So now the dates are available for the month of August, September. It would be available on College Board to register for these tests in the first week of May. So therein you can register yourself for those tests. Are there any courses available in Dubai? If it is related to SAT, yes, we at the Princeton Review, Suzanne, if it is related to SAT, the Princeton Review are the SAT test providers, preparation providers. So you can always do the SAT prep through us, be it online or the way you want. Rohan, where can you put summer session in your application? Summer, I mean, going to US and join summer program.
Correct.
So where you can put in the application?
Where it says, like, you know, they usually say, like, again, this is an academic thing, but they usually ask you how, you know, either in the essay form or in the activities form, they usually ask you how you spent your summer.
Right.
And that's one of the major places where you enter it.
So basically, Rohan, there are few universities in their application form, they ask specifically that how you spent your last 2 summers. They also ask for essays. There are essay topics which are related to your summer activities. And if you do not have if you're not applying to those set of universities asking for such questions, then you can definitely list down in the activity list.
Right.
Arya, can we write SAT after 12th and before college? So that's a little difficult question, Arya, because if you are in 12th, if you are completing 12th, let's say suppose in 2020.
Last year, by the way, not 13.
Last year. Yeah, so then before college, if you are taking SAT, then I would suggest you look at the universities which are either SAT optional or the universities, you have to check the deadline basically. I can't say like this. I would suggest drop us an email in the next slide information. We can have a one-on-one session and can discuss a complete what exactly where you are and how you should progress. For how long is the validity of the SAT exam? It is for 5 years. And how many times must one write SAT? Dennis, you would like to answer?
Again,
how many times?
Darryl answered this, but, you know, so I would say, and we both agree that, you know, maximum 3 times. So you should prep for 1, however you're going to prep. You should plan for 2, but just in case, you should give yourself time for 3. But then after 3, you know, you can take more, but it looks weird, right? Because you have a lot of things to do, including all these extracurriculars you're doing, right? So, you know, a lot of admissions officers will say, doesn't the student have anything better to do than to keep taking the SAT over and over again? So, yeah, but essentially, try to max it out at three times.
Dennis,
Yes?
can we go to next slide so that they can
Oh, sorry.
check the information? No, that's fine. I mean, we are on the question round, but if in case it would be easier for them to take the information.
Yes. here, right?
Okay, let me just check if we have any other questions. I guess, okay, what is the, I used to be a part team from 6th, but I stopped in 10th grade, so I won't be able
Look, if you stopped it, right? So again, think about at the beginning of the presentation, right? Where I said, you know, you should write what activities display your interests and display any possible leadership roles, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so if you dropped it in grade 10, which is I think what you said, what does that tell an admissions officer about what that activity means to you? Right? Unless it's a sport, and you said it was athletics, right? So unless you had, kind of like, it was a struggle to give it up. So you were maybe wounded in some way, or you had to give it up because your academics were really suffering. That's a more interesting story, right? But if you gave it up in grade 10, I wouldn't mention it.
Okay, I think Dennis, we have to end up our webinar now in next few minutes. So if in case you have any further questions, and definitely thank you for your active participation and attending this webinar. If you have any question, you can make a note of this email ID. Yeah, you can just drop an email and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. I would also, Peter, are you there?
Thanks very much.
Yeah, Peter would like to add something if in case Peter related to SAT.
Great. Yeah, I think there's a couple of questions about when they should be doing the prep and, are the courses available. So like Daryl mentioned in this slide, we do have a couple of prep options, right from self-paced to a blended program to ultimate prep to a program which guarantees a 1500 score, right? Provided you start at a 1400 score. But we do have a lot of prep options as well in Dubai as well. And we also have an opportunity for each one of you to do a mock test as well, right? So feel free to email us and reach out to us, right? And we'll be happy to assist you. Great. Thank you very much for attending.